As a testament to how substantial the impact was that this contactee movement had on culture at this time, just check out this ad from the 1960 presidential campaign of Gabriel Green. Green being another contactee and student of theosophy and the occult. He would run again in 1972 representing the Universal Party, along with none other than Daniel Fry as his vice presidential nominee. Although both of these campaigns were predictably very unsuccessful, it certainly highlights the relative influence that the alien contact movement was having in America at this time. I mean, in fairness to history, this whole contactee movement was met largely with ridicule, and it really wasn't taken seriously by most people in the media or general public. However, it seems to me that these events definitely helped to popularize and also normalize this concept of alien contact. You know, conditioned by the incessant media coverage of UFOs and contactees, the public was growing accustomed to these ideas. I mean, it was still a fringe topic, but one that was becoming less controversial by the year. Now, as of today, this whole movement is generally regarded as a joke, and with good reason. I mean, it's not difficult to argue that all of these godless knuckleheads probably weren't making psychic contact, with friendly alien beings out there just minding their own business and living out their lives on distant planets. But if you haven't figured it out yet, witchcraft is real. And demonic interactions are real. And I think that a lot of people who practice witchcraft don't even understand that that's what they're doing. And I also think that demons are on constant lookout for susceptible humans who are foolishly opening themselves up to this type of relationship. So if these aliens in question were actually demons, which I think I'm making a pretty decent argument for here, then I would say that many of these contactees were being honest about their communications, because we know that communication with demons through magic and ritual meditation is not only possible, but it's biblical. And to be clear, it's strictly forbidden. And I also wouldn't consider it a coincidence that this type of messaging continues to rally around the same New Age and New World Order propaganda that's being pushed onto society more so now than ever before. And if I didn't know any better, it would almost seem like all of these aliens from Venus in the 1950s were actually just employees of the United Nations and just promoting Agenda 2030 all the way back then, but I'm pretty sure that's not what was going on. But moving forward, as we consider the implications of this coming alien deception and potential invasion, I think perhaps we should look back at this era when the act of summoning demons, or also known as communicating with aliens, became a popular cultural trend. And I hope that you can comprehend the significance that all of this was happening alongside the growing popularity of alien-themed science fiction, in a society that was also being simultaneously razzled and dazzled by new advancements in technology that were changing the public's perspective of the future. And all of this hype around UFOs and alien contact only expanded as we headed into the 1960s, because the 1960s were a transformative period in the entertainment industry, both in the magnitude of impact that it had on culture, but also the increasingly propagandized nature of the content in popular entertainment. It was the first generation in which the average American family owned a television. So TV was no longer a novelty of the wealthy, and shows like Star Trek and Outer Limits and Twilight Zone were being broadcast into millions of living rooms, and movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey and Planet of the Apes were mainstream hits. I mean, of course, the 1950s saw its fair share of classic alien-themed movies too, like War of the Worlds and The Day the Earth Stood Still, but by the end of the following decade, it had totally pervaded public consciousness. And for the few of you out there who somehow don't understand this yet, mass media continues to be the primary source of influence on our modern culture. I suppose that's another topic for another movie, but I think it's clear to see in hindsight the magnitude of ways that our culture has been influenced by fictional entertainment, and how much modern scientific thought was influenced by science fiction. And I really hope that I've done well to communicate that fact throughout this film, because it's a really important factor to keep in frame of the context of everything we're discussing here. And while writing this movie, I continue to ponder and just be reminded of the importance of belief and faith in context to how people interpret their own spiritual experiences. It's something that I think about often, as it relates to my own faith in Christ. But even when I research another religion, or even satanic occult groups, as in this case, I do acknowledge the potential for followers of these false religions to produce some possibly legitimate results by the practice of their faith, and even perhaps according to their rituals. Now, of course, if this is true, it's only possible through the permissive will of God. In fact, everything that Satan does is through the permission of God. But the Bible does speak of magicians and sorcerers who were able to perform some limited feats of amazement, and seeming miracles, like replicating some of the plagues in Egypt in Exodus, when they attempted to mimic the miracles of God. And of course, these magicians were losers, and they weren't powerful in the true sense of the word, but foolish heathens who were playing with spiritual dynamite and consistently failed to thwart the will of God or to ever really impress the followers of God. Honestly, it's not impossible that a lot of these biblical magicians could have been just mere illusionists, like David Blaine or Chris Angel, and just relying on trickery or sleight of hand. And they certainly weren't too impressive in the book of Genesis when they were unable and helpless to interpret Pharaoh's dream. And of course, Joseph, a man of God, was able to do so through his faith in the actual God. But the point is that magic is real, so to whatever extent that might be, it's real. And its presence here in modern society is not an invention of these historic satanic cults, but it's represented in the culmination of each and every religion or spiritual system which opposes the one true God. That's the way the Bible would put it. You're either for God or you're against him, and if you're directing your worship or putting your faith in any other God than the one true God, well, then you're putting your faith in a false God, and to communicate with a false God is magic. And honestly, from my perspective, it seems like magic has never really been more popular than it is right now in this current generation. I'm watching a society that has succumbed to the magical pursuit of what's being called manifestation techniques, and there's all these popular outlets now that promise that you can create your own reality, and we could even initiate the physical manifestation of our desires through the practice of religiously visualizing and affirming its existence in our minds. And this type of thing, it's just standard magic. But in a godless society that promotes witchcraft, the general public is now none the wiser, and people tend to take an empathetic and innocent view towards these things because it's dressed up with all this modern lingo. And we see it promoted through sources that are perceived to be wholesome, like Oprah Winfrey or Disney. But make no mistake that this concept of manipulating reality through concentrated meditation is the essence of what ritual magic is really all about. And it's why rituals like the Babylon Working and others involve chants and imagery and reading and, most importantly, repetition. It's all about aligning your mind and spirit with a concentrated and focused intention to manifest whatever it is that you desire to manifest. And when multiple practitioners focus their combined energy on the same image, or the same idea simultaneously, then its potential for success should be strengthened accordingly. And of course, the more sincere the practitioners, the more potent its effect. So this is the philosophy of magic. And it was no doubt the belief that was shared by Parsons and many of his visitors to the parsonage who saw UFOs in the vicinity of that location. After all, they were trying to summon them. And the same could be said about the location of the Giant Rock Space Convention that I mentioned earlier, where large crowds gathered to participate in contact sessions. And there's a lot of historical examples that seem to show that when multiple people get together and start meditating and focusing on UFOs, sightings are not all that uncommon. So could it be that these aliens are truly responding to the calls, and making appearances to those who want to believe? And if that's the case, then how much more prevalent should we expect these sightings to be across a society that would become exponentially saturated in the lore of alien visitation and alien invasion? Because this was no longer the same world that Jack Parsons grew up in, where ideas like space travel and intelligent life on alien planets were merely the stuff of fantasy. No, this idea was now being suggested and even postulated by the mainstream media. And whatever these aliens were, and whether this UFO craze was related to real-life extraterrestrials or deceptive demons, or even simple figments of the public's collective imagination, there was no denying that society had become lost in space. And science fiction had now reached its golden age, and with topics like aliens and spaceships and intergalactic travel becoming its most popular and dominant theme. And one of the most influential books from this era was Stranger in a Strange Land by legendary science fiction author Robert Heinlein. Published in 1961, the story centers around a character named Valentine Michael Smith, a human who is raised by Martians and then returns to Earth with these incredible powers and a unique perspective on life and spirituality. And then this character goes on to invent a religion on Earth called the Church of All Worlds. And this religion incorporates all types of occultic elements, and various spiritual traditions, including paganism and Hinduism and Western esotericism. Now, what's interesting is that 1 year after the publication of Stranger in a Strange Land, the book went on to inspire a real-life religion by the same name of the Church of All Worlds. And this religion still exists and thrives today, apparently. It's described as an American neo-pagan religious group whose stated mission is to evolve a network of information, mythology, and experience that provides a context and stimulus for reawakening Gaia. And in case you don't know, Gaia is like the goddess of Earth. And so once again, we're seeing this call to religious unity, the one common theme among all these UFO cults, as well as just New Age religions in general. And this Heinlein-inspired Church of All Worlds also publishes a magazine that is of relative popularity within these circles called Green Egg. Because, of course, remember, it's all in the egg. And it's another thing I'm going to avoid delving into for the sake of time, but you can find some issues of the magazine online if you feel inclined. You'll see that its pages are filled with nothing but magic spells and pagan rituals, and occasional articles penned by prominent atheists and occultists or science fiction writers. And it's certainly not something that I'd encourage you to consume regularly, but I think it does help you to understand the robust relationship that really does exist between modern philosophy, science, and witchcraft. Now, Robert Heinlein was not only a prolific science fiction author, but as a former accomplished aeronautical engineer, he was a voice of scientific authority. His books have been widely acclaimed by the academic community, who could appreciate Heinlein's reputation for scientific accuracy. And as it turns out, Robert Heinlein was also a close personal friend with none other than our man Jack Parsons, and the two would correspond regularly. And I find it really interesting that such a scientifically minded person like Robert Heinlein would resonate with Parsons' more abstract and spiritually based perception of astronomy and the nature of our universe. But that seems to be the case, and they would discuss these things regularly. Some have even speculated that it was his conversations with Parsons that served as an inspiration for Stranger in a Strange Land. As a quick tangent, whenever I think of Robert Heinlein, I think of my dad. Because my dad was one of these kids from this era who loved to read science fiction. One of his favorites was called Tunnel in the Sky by Heinlein. And so I was sort of disappointed to learn about his associations with the occult and with Jack Parsons and all this stuff, but when you really start digging into these topics, you'll get used to becoming disillusioned in your perspective of history. My dad also loved the book Battlefield Earth, which was written by none other than L. Ron Hubbard. But I actually read and enjoyed Battlefield Earth as well. And don't get the wrong idea, it's not like my dad was into Scientology. Really, the only books that I would ever see him read regularly were his Bible and My Utmost for His Highest by Oswald Chambers. But no, the reason I bring up my dad is because he was born right in the middle of this timeline that we're focusing on, in the mid-1950s. And in his youth, he loved to read science fiction just like so many people from that generation did. And as a kid, I loved to hear him talk about all these old stories that he remembered from these old science fiction books, His eyes would just light up as he recalled these exciting adventures and unexpected plot twists, and all the amazing technologies and incredible worlds that you read about in these classic science fiction books. And as we've seen, science fiction has been the primary catalyst that has now pushed the one-time occult belief in alien civilizations and interstellar travel into the socially accepted mainstream worldview of modern times. And to quickly allude back to Jack Parsons, it's clear to see how dramatically science fiction and fantasy novels would motivate his pursuits in both science as well as magic. In fact, Parsons was a proud member of the Los Angeles Science Fiction Society, and he was a personal friend to a number of legendary science fiction writers, including Ray Bradbury and A.E. Van Vogt and Jack Williamson, and of course Robert Heinlein and the infamous L. Ron Hubbard, just to name the most notable of them. And it just seems like these connections never end. And here's another one. Not only were Heinlein and Hubbard both close friends with Jack Parsons, but they were also friends with one another. Very good friends, actually. And I didn't know this before I started writing this movie, but it's widely believed that the two men, meaning Heinlein and Hubbard, made a bet in a bar one night to see who could successfully create a religion first. And if it's true, then Heinlein's Church of All Worlds would have been his attempt, and then L. Ron Hubbard would have been the clear winner with the success of his Scientology. And you know what? It almost just seems crazy enough to be true. But despite the popularity of the story, I wasn't able to verify it. But still, even if it's just an urban legend, it is reassuring to know that I'm not the only one drawing these comparisons. And before moving on, since I mentioned earlier that I had enjoyed the book Battlefield Earth by L. Ron Hubbard, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that the movie version, which stars famous Scientologist John Travolta, is supposedly one of the worst movies ever. I mean, it's apparently really, really bad. But, however bad the movie is, it couldn't be any dumber than his religion of Scientology.
Hubbard first came to public attention as a science fiction writer. Many of his policy directives and much of his philosophy seems to reflect that background. Its purpose, according to its charter, is to propagate a religious faith known as Scientology. A sign in the window advertises a tract on mental health.
Everything that one reaches for in Scientology is always beyond you. And at each level that you're at, there is that fear factor that if I don't do this right, they won't let me have the next.
I basically wanted to reconcile a situation within my family so that my wife and I would have common objectives. And as a result of that, entered and progressed along as far as I could.
I signed what is a contract. I signed a contract for 1 billion years. 1 billion years.
Members invite people in the street to come in for free personality analysis. A W5 researcher who took the test was then asked to sign up for an initial course costing $25. Later courses can come in packages that cost up to $3,000. The courses often include a process called auditing with a machine called an e-meter. A Scientology publication claims that such auditing may improve the subject's IQ. This 1 billion year contract would appear to be, legally, an unconscionable document. The implication is that the signer will continue to serve the organization in future lives. Hubbard has said Scientology is as important to mankind as the invention of the wheel and the arch. Devotion to the Scientology creed is costly. An individual can spend as much as $8,000 trying to reach the improved state known to Scientologists as clear. These are just a few of the courses Scientology offers. Each course has a prerequisite, which also costs money. The church doesn't talk about fees, but states that payment for these courses is a donation to further the cause.
My thoughts are that they're afraid to really admit that they got took. Completely took. Every single one of them
That's not true.
But you were duped, Mother.
I was not duped, Susan.
Mother, you were.
Okay, I grant your beingness to think I was duped. But I know I wasn't. I know I have benefited.
But Mother,
And any benefit I have had outweighs any detriment I have had.
An advertisement for the e-meter. Scientologists call it a confessional aid. The machine measures galvanic skin resistance. Similar instruments are components in conventional lie detectors.
Have you ever been a member of a communist party or any associated group?
No.
All right. Have you ever had any unkind thoughts about L. Ron Hubbard?
No.
For a Scientologist to have an unkind thought about L. Ron Hubbard would definitely be considered an outness, and the person having such a thought might be considered suppressive.
Have you ever had any unkind thoughts about L. Ron Hubbard?
No, not really.
All right. Your needle's floating. And that's the end of the session. That's it. You can put the cans down.
I'm sorry. I don't have to admit that it ripped me. I don't believe that it ripped me. I'm the only one in this whole room that doesn't believe it ripped me. And I really, really, really mean that.
I don't agree with you.
I don't agree with that.
Okay, fine, you don't have to. But I know Scientology does have a truth. It has the truth, as I see it. It's there, and I want it.
There's a lot of truth in the Bible. Everywhere in life. Everywhere in life.
Listen.
And of course, Scientology is like the premier UFO religion, teaching that humanity was transported to Earth 75 million years ago in a giant spaceship that was directed under the leadership of an alien god named Xenu. And according to L. Ron Hubbard, this Xenu was a real tyrant. He was the highly respected and powerful leader of the so-called Galactic Confederacy, which governed a bunch of different alien planets. But unfortunately for Xenu, his draconian and tyrannical ways would come to an end when he was eventually overthrown by the Confederacy and sent off to live in solitude on some desert planet where he still lives to this day. Again, according to the theology of Scientology. In Scientology, the human body is considered to be a mere capsule for the soul, which they call a thetan, or thetan. I think it's thetan. Anyways, Hubbard taught that when the body dies, the thetan goes on to what he referred to as a landing station, where it is then cleansed and replaced into a new capsule and then sent back to Earth. And I also bet you won't be too surprised to learn that this spiritual landing station is located on the planet Venus. I mean, obviously, right? And these are just a few examples of the wacky theology that somehow continues to impress so many Scientologists. Now, in my opinion of reading through Hubbard's account of humanity's origin and the history of the universe, it's humorously similar to reading through his science fiction stories. And the method of research that he employed to construct this backstory for his religion was conducted by recalling his own alleged past lives and then interviewing a large number of his followers about their past lives. And then this would become the source by which all of his theology was based. And from the downfall of Xenu to the rise of the Thetans, the story plays out, just like that, a story. Hubbard himself even called the demonstration of his theology space opera, a term already associated with an existing genre of science fiction. The official website of the Church of Scientology describes space opera this way. Space opera has space travel, spaceships, spacemen, intergalactic travel, wars, conflicts, other beings, civilizations and societies, and other planets and galaxies. It is not fiction and concerns actual incidents. And apparently Hubbard had no apprehension in weaving his theology with science fiction, explaining that the stories were either literally true or that they encapsulated a true idea or event. And for a price, Hubbard would vaguely relay these stories to his congregation in an esoteric and convoluted way that would leave even master-level Thetans confused about which parts of the story were supposedly true or deliberately fiction.
Do you ever think that you might be quite mad?
Oh, yes. The one man in the world who never believes he's mad is a madman.
And by the way, all of this information that I just gave you is really valuable because in Scientology, you got to spend money and purchase information to advance in the ranks. This information about Xenu, for example, is generally reserved for level 3 Thetans, and it's only intended to be purchased by members of the cult like Tom Cruise or John Travolta or the guy that played Hyde on that 70s show. And it's obviously kind of strange to consider that the man behind such a formidable and well-known empire as Scientology was at one time running around naked in the Mojave Desert with the founder of JPL while performing rituals and engaging in sex magic. Although I suppose in another way, when you look around the world today, it kind of makes sense. And the truth is that Scientology is not an anomaly, and Hubbard happens to be in good company. Take a look at this guy. This is Claude Vorilhon, the one-time sports journalist and auto racing fan that would later become Rael, the spiritual leader of his own religion called Raelism, and another New Age messiah and alien messenger who is worshipped by thousands. Now, chances are that you've at least heard of this guy before, because Raelism is among the most prominent UFO cults ever, claiming tens of thousands of members. And they've been all over TV and the media, and Saturday Night Live used to even have a skit making fun of them. And like Scientology, the Raelian movement has the funding and resources of a contemporary religion, which seems ironic to some because Raelism defines itself as an atheistic organization. And I would say that that's the one thing I agree with them about, that atheism is in itself a religion. Raelism is actually a great example of that. And not only do they consider themselves to be an atheistic organization, but they also claim science to be the method by which they interpret the universe. And Rael is also the proudly perverted mastermind behind such events as Go Topless Day and numerous masturbation advocacy campaigns. And his cult is just obsessed with sex and with the public exhibition of it. And you can't have sex all day without making some babies in the process. And that's why Raelians are also staunch advocates of abortion. And they promote and contribute to causes like gay pride parades and transgender programs. And they campaign for things like condom vending machines in high schools. And they protest against things like pro-life rallies. And so to put it plainly, Raelism fits right in with our society, now more than ever. And to the uninitiated mind, the Raelian movement would seem to be just a bunch of fun-loving progressive hippies who just want to make love and not war, and happen to believe in aliens. But that's not to say they haven't had their fair share of public notoriety and criticism.
Rael, you are recognized to testify for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me. I have a request is to include to my text a manifesto signed by 36 top scientists and philosophers of the world from New Humanist Association, including Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the DNA, and numerous Nobel Prize laureates who support the freedom for human cloning as part of freedom of science, be attached to my testimony?
That objection will be included in the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to dedicate my testimony to Giordano Bruno, who was burned alive 4 centuries ago, sentenced to the death penalty by the Catholic Church for saying that there was life on other planets. Why did I ask Brigitte Boisselier to create the first human company in America? Because as the country of freedom, you have a constitution which should be a model for the whole world. And the most wonderful jewel of your system, the Supreme Court, which guarantees the respect of your constitution and the freedom of your citizen, even against your own government and lawmakers. I'm quite confident that even if human cloning was banned, the Supreme Court of America would cancel this law as unconstitutional, as they did for IVF.
In 1997, Rael established an organization that he called Clonaid, which engaged in the research and development of human cloning technology. And in 2002, the company claimed to have produced the first human clone, a baby girl named Eve. And yes, this was a direct reference to Eve from Genesis. And yet, despite this controversy, Raelism continues to grow even to this day. And they're always portrayed by the media to be this innocent group of wacky tinfoil hat-wearing science fiction enthusiasts. But I just want to point out the blatantly blasphemous and satanic foundation of this group's doctrine. And after everything else that we've been through in this video, I think you will understand why. Now, according to the false message of Claude Vorilhon, or I'm sorry, Rael, we are all actually the descendants of alien gods who are known as the Elohim. And of course, this word Elohim is actually a Hebrew name for God that is used throughout the Old Testament. Now, according to the testimony of Rael, this all started in 1973 as he was wandering through some mountains in France when he came across an alien spaceship that was grounded near an inactive volcano. And according to Claude, he was then approached by a 25,000-year-old alien by the name of Yahweh. And of course, the name Yahweh is yet another biblical name for God the Father. And then, in a scene ripped straight from Star Wars, Yahweh goes on to reveal his true identity, proclaiming himself to be Claude's biological father. And this is a revelation that would immediately elevate Vorilhon from a modest sports writer and automobile enthusiast to a biological son of God. And according to Rael, this miraculous encounter would only be the first in an ongoing relationship, which he maintained with his alien dad and his Elohim cousins. And at some point, he was instructed to change his name to Rael, because Claude just is not a fitting name for the Messiah. And in the religion of Raelism, he is accepted by his followers to be the true Son of God. And as such, his words and writings are regarded as authoritative scripture. And now, in the midst of all this biblical terminology, you might be wondering where Jesus fits into this picture. But unsurprisingly, Raelism has an answer for that too. You see, as it turns out, Jesus Christ himself was yet another alien prophet sent to earth by the Elohim, along with Moses, Elijah, Ezekiel, Buddha, John the Baptist, Muhammad, and even Joseph Smith. And by the account of Claude Vorilhon, he is the 40th and final prophet of the Elohim. And if you've been paying attention, then you would have noted by now that this use of biblical terminology is really prevalent within these New Age religions. And it's kind of weird because these magicians and sorcerers seem to look at the Bible as if it's another magical oracle and attempting to decipher the scriptures through an occult lens. And by the way, this is what mystery Babylonian teaching is all about. But I really think that Raelism takes blasphemy to a whole nother level within the realm of these UFO cults, because the entire philosophy is just a distortion of scriptures that have been cherry-picked directly from the Bible. For example, according to the theology of Raelism, the Garden of Eden from Genesis 1 is said to be an alien scientific laboratory, probably not too different from Rael's Clonaid facility. And instead of Lucifer appearing to Eve and tempting her to eat of the forbidden fruit, according to Raelism, Lucifer was yet another alien who led a group of scientists in a genetic engineering lab to study this created man's behavior. And the biblical fall of man was actually just the result of Lucifer telling the creation the truth about their existence. And this is a common perspective in Gnostic and occult literature, by the way, to present the character of Lucifer as an empathetic and heroic figure. And then Rael goes on to teach that Noah's Ark was actually a giant spaceship that was lifted up above Earth and used to preserve and store the genetic material that was later used to resurrect animals through cloning. Raelians do acknowledge the occurrence of the Great Flood, but they explain it to be the byproduct of an atomic missile explosion that the alien Elohim sent. And Raelians even have their own disturbing version of the biblical end times, one in which the third temple described in Revelation must be built in or near Jerusalem. But unlike the biblical interpretation of this prophecy, where the construction of this third temple ushers in the arrival of the Antichrist, for Raelians, the third temple will invite the arrival of, you guessed it, the Elohim aliens in their spaceships. And in case you're thinking that this stuff has fizzled out, then think again, as Raelians have reported making great progress in their pursuits as recently as 2022. And if you've been following my channel long enough, you know that the Raelians are not alone in this pursuit of building the third temple. And by the way, in case you disagree with my narrative of sci-fi entertainment being the primary catalyst and influence behind the emergence of these UFO cults, then I would like to point out this Benny Hinn-like outfit that Rael is always wearing. You know, it's like a Halloween costume that was designed to reflect all of the corniest and most cliche elements of science fiction. You know, of course, he's wearing his famous Raelian pendant that features a swastika enclosed in the six-pointed star, and then this hair thing. I mean, you guys, come on. Why would he do this with his hair if not to impersonate some generic villain from the show Star Trek? You know, I mean, I'm kidding, but I'm also serious. I mean, these origin stories, you know, they're all just as fantastical and cliche as Hubbard's infamous space operas. And the names of these alien gods, you know, Xenu, Orthon, Aetherius, it's enough to make you feel as if you're watching Mystery Science Theater 3000.
On the planet Semar, far within the Mufine galaxy, a decontrolled robot assassinated the omnipotent Balazar, who is known to possess the most brilliant mind in the universe. So powerful was Balazar's genius that as he lay dying, his brain ordered built a mechanism which would keep it alive even though his body was destroyed. And now Balazar's brain seeks universal conquest. The council now is deciding what must be done.
We number in the many thousands. We are projecting to you with all of our hearts the infinite love that stems from the most high dimensions.
Save up to 80% on your New Age books, records, CDs, audio, and videotapes with no obligation whatever by joining the New Age Media Club.
Read about the reality of extraterrestrial life and the future of Earth within an interplanetary confederation in a new book, Preparation for the Landing, by cosmic visionary Uriel, published by the Unarius Educational Foundation.
The New Age America Video Catalog lets you meet the leading spokespersons, companies, and products within the New Age industry. The New Age America Video Catalog is your key to the future, featuring New Age music, crystals, astrology, numerology, spirituality, books, UFOs, and much, much more.
Preparation for the Landing. Are you ready?
I fully acknowledge that I wouldn't know the first thing about what motivates the pursuits of an extraterrestrial, you know, or of Lamb, but we do know from Scripture what motivates the pursuits of Satan and of his demons. We know that Satan wanders about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, as written in 1 Peter 5. He blinds the minds of unbelievers, he exploits a lack of understanding, he imitates religious roles, he misuses Scripture, he attacks the faith of believers, and he indulges the delusions of unbelievers. And as we went over before, not only is he a liar, but he's described by Jesus as the father of lies. You know, and he's also the god of this world, so perhaps those two things combined make sense when you take a look at this world around you. And so that's the demonic motivations of our enemy, you know, to persecute the truth of God's word and those who believe and follow it, and then to lead everybody else into deception. But to complete my point, although society may have done away with the contactee movement and with the proliferation of these UFO cults that were emerging in the 1950s, it's pretty apparent that public interest in alien abductions began to grow rapidly in the early 1980s, alongside a dramatic increase of real-life abduction reports and many more reported cases of close encounters of the third kind. And I think that this increase was undoubtedly influenced by the sweeping cultural impact that movies and entertainment were having on society by this time. The 1980s brought a booming economy to Hollywood. You know, it was a generation characterized by pop culture and social trends. And MTV was unleashed on society, subjecting the masses to this MK Ultra style mind control. And pop stars like Michael Jackson and Madonna were spending million-dollar budgets on music videos and stage performances. And really, entertainment had never been more profitable. You know, film budgets were bigger and special effects had entered a new tier of technical ability. It was a futuristic generation, replete with a wide array of new technologies, from personal computers and video game consoles to camcorders, VCRs, and cable television. You know, so never before was this fantasy world so immersive and so easily accessible. And so when I see these statistics that show a big spike of interest in alien close encounters and abductions, and then when I consider the fact that the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out in 1977, I'm not that surprised by it. You know, I think it's fair to assume that most people didn't even know what a close encounter of the third kind was before the movie came out. And there was also a burgeoning industry for conspiracy-based entertainment by this time. And thousands of books were published with titles like The Truth About Roswell and The Flying Saucers Are Real. And the belief that governments were engaged in conspiracies and cover-ups was steadily becoming more popular. For example, the story of Barney and Betty Hill had now become a national headline through the success of the book Interrupted Journey by John Fuller. And Americans were starting to develop a healthy but misguided distrust in government, you know, because a lot had changed since the inception of the UFO and contactee movement in the 1950s. New technologies had enabled an expansion in media and in media consumption, and although things like government corruption and conspiracy were nothing new, they had never before received this level of coverage. You know, and events like the assassination of JFK or the questions around the moon landing and the Watergate scandal had planted a seed of doubt in public trust. And from the 1980s onward, this proliferation of alien invasion movies has only grown. And the lamb-like grays would become today's stereotypical expression of an alien, you know. And the popular alien-themed science fiction at this time would also start to shift into darker themes, more commonly depicting these spiritual and psychological elements that I just spent the last 2 hours relating to demonic possession. You know, often with humans as the helpless victims and the prey of these aliens, as opposed to the heroes and conquerors that the more innocent old-timers imagined us as. And the old narrative of friendly space brothers inviting contactees to join them on guided space tours, you know, aboard their flying saucers, well, those stories disappeared, only to be replaced by a new narrative of these malevolent interdimensional aliens manifesting into the bedrooms of terrified humans to initiate a terrible sequence of torture and abuse. And this transition was accommodated by a new brand of contactee movement as well.